Have a look.
I'm going to leave this in here. Handsome.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Channel Surfing down at the dock. We're going to talk about inboard versus outboard. So the specifics of this, it's kind of a challenging topic. Why we chose the outboard over the inboard. I'm going to be more specific to Ranger Tug's product line. They do, the majority of their boats have been inboards, which were diesel. And they've got a wide variety of horsepower ratings and different size boats. On the outboards, it's a little there's lesser options. The 23 footer, the 25 footer, and the 27 footer all have outboards. And then you get to the cutwater, where the cutwater 24 and the cutwater 32 have outboards. Everything else in their product lines are all diesel, which are an inboard, right? But the main thing is outboard versus inboard is the topic of discussion. So we went with an outboard for two main reasons. One was speed, and the other was the outboard being on the back of the boat meant that when I have to do maintenance on the engine, I'm not hanging upside down, my feet in the air in cramped spaces, dropping my tools into the bilge, never to be seen again until something happens that the engine's got to be pulled out of the boat. All right, so that said, similarities between inboards and outboards. Everybody talks about maintenance costs between the two, and you can do your own research on that. I highly encourage you to. Generally speaking, they're about the same. They're close enough to not worry about between them. Fuel efficiencies is also very similar between the inboard and the outboards. Right, you're talking similarly equipped engines. So engine longevity. This is subject at best. It depends how you look at it, how you're going to use the boat. No question that a diesel inboard would outperform a gasoline outboard on hours used in a commercial setting. No question on that, right? There's a YouTube video that I found when I was doing my research on outboards and longevity that has a water taxi that had over 7,000 hours on a pair of Yamaha engines. Obviously, it's a commercial operation. They're running those engines all the time. I think they've done it twice. Over 7,000 hours on the pair, then another one with over 8,000 hours on the pair. The outboard could cover twice as much ground for the same number of hours compared to an inboard. This goes back to the speed, which is why we went with the outboard, right? Understanding that for a recreational boater, we didn't feel that we would notice the difference in a lifespan between an inboard versus an outboard, right? If you can get 7,000 plus hours on a pair of outboards in a commercial setting, at 4,000 hours, that's 200 hours a year, every year for 20 years, right? Recreational usage in general involves lots of start-stops, lots of infrequent usage. This is to both inboards and outboards, and all of that infrequent usage and starts and stops is what causes wear and tear on the engines. So we looked at the two and said, all right, we didn't think we would wear out an outboard before an inboard diesel with how we plan to use the boat for as long as we plan to have the boat. So the longevity didn't factor into our decision. Maintenance costs and fuel efficiencies were close enough between the two. It was like we could go either way, right? So it really came down to one of the main differences being speed. So on the outboard, we comfortably cruise at about 25 knots most of the time. Our max speed's about 35 knots, which is just over 40 miles an hour. The inboards cruise anywhere from 5 knots to about 20 knots, depending on the specific Ranger boat you have, what year it was built, and the type of diesel that was put into it. For the same amount another way to look at this is, for the same amount of hours that you put on that engine, the outboard is going to cover twice as much ground as the inboard would do. All right, or you could say I'll get there in half the time. And for us, time was pretty important. You have to be careful when you're out cruising, especially in saltwater with a lot of deadheads and stuff. Trees and stuff that float down. So I don't know that I want to go much faster than 25 knots. You certainly have to pay a lot of attention at that speed. But our last boat would do 60 miles an hour in flat water, and that is way too fast for Puget Sound. Routine maintenance between the inboard and the outboard. So the inboard, I think, is better in this regard because you don't have to pull the boat out of the water. For the outboard, you technically could change the spark plugs and change the oil in the engine with it in the water, but you can't do the impeller. You can't do the lower gear oil. The boat's got to come out of the water, drop the lower unit out to do that. The work's not hard, but you can't do it in the water. So if you were looking to buy a boat and you wanted to do the Great Loop back east, an inboard might be a better option because you can. It's a long trip, and you could do the maintenance at the dock. Whereas if you have an outboard, you're going to have to find a place to do a haul out. Propeller replacement, inboard versus outboard. Obviously, if you ding your prop or need it replaced and it's an inboard, you need to haul the boat out of the water or get a diver. If it's the outboard, you probably could change the prop standing up on a dinghy on the back of the boat. If you ding something, you can always easily pull the outboard up and see what damage is done easily while you're out in the water. So talking about gas versus diesel, because obviously when I say the word inboard, I'm really talking about a diesel, even though there are gas inboards. Ranger Tug doesn't have any gas inboards, so I don't consider that. But people will say, well, if you have an outboard, you have gasoline on board. Gasoline's more volatile. All right. True, if you pour gas in a bilge, it's more volatile than diesel in a bilge, right? Without question. However, with fuel-injected engines, there's no exposed gas. The only time we smell gas in our boat is if I'm changing the fuel filter or I'm fueling at the fuel dock. Other than that, we never smell it. So we don't have to run a blower, to ventilate any spaces on our boat because of that. Inboards also have gas on board because they probably have a gas generator for electric, and they probably have an outboard for their dinghy that's gas, right? So there's a gas container somewhere on an inboard boat regardless, right? Outboards also have diesel on board. I have a 5.5 gallon diesel tank that's used for the Webasto heater, right? So I would say inboard, outboard, you're going to have both fuels in limited quantities between the two. Cooling water, outboard's raw water cooled. Inboard is freshwater cooled with a heat exchanger, but there's still a raw water side that's going to take maintenance. And then you've got antifreeze and stuff on the freshwater side of the cooling, which is all inboard on the engine. On the outboard, it's raw water cooled, and you say, well, the seawater then is going to deteriorate the engine quicker, right? On the Yamaha F300, there's 8 sacrificial anodes inside the cooling jacket on the engine. They're supposed to be replaced every 300 to 500 hours. And they're not to buy them, they're not that expensive, and to replace them isn't all that tough. For winterizing on an outboard, since it's raw water cooled, all you do is just put the engine in the water so it's vertical, so whatever water's up top falls into the water it's sitting in, right? Or if it's on a trailer, it all drains out of it. Storage space, another big difference between inboard and outboard. Inboard takes up a good portion of the space in the back of the boat underneath the in the cockpit. On outboard, you get all that space. That's where we moved our house battery bank to, was there, right? So, hot water is another big difference between inboard and outboard. With a outboard engine with hot water, the only way you're going to get hot water is to run the inverter, which is electric, off of the batteries, and then use the outboard as a electric generator to be able to generate enough power to power the hot water, and that's challenging at best, I will admit. Usually, we just leave the dock with our hot water hot, and it'll last for 1 to 2 days that way. And then with the battery upgrades that we did and idling the engine, we can run the inverter and get hot water. Plus, it's a small hot water tank on the boat. However, the inboard, you could idle the inboard engine, and the raw water that cools the engine goes through a heat exchanger into the hot water tank. So technically, the heat from the engine heats the hot water on an inboard. And as a secondary method, when you're tied up to the dock, then AC power would heat the hot water tank on an inboard. Dinghy storage. This is probably it's number 1 or number 2, depending if you're talking about being able to do maintenance, routine maintenance on the dock on a long trip like the Great Loop, that's where an inboard's going to have an advantage. The other one is dinghy storage, which is huge, right? The outboard presents a huge challenge on the back of the boat with where to carry your dinghy. If it's an inboard, you have the transom all available to hang the dinghy off the back, makes for easy deploy and retrieve. Ranger Tug does have a dinghy lift that can fit on the back of off of an outboard. It's kind of like a metal structure that goes around the outboard to hold the dinghy. Well, the challenges with that is if you were trying to fish, let's say you were trying to land a salmon on the back of the boat with that dinghy lift there, that is going to get in the way of fishing. If you want to check the oil in the outboard engine, you have to deploy the dinghy to do it. So it's all about compromise. We've got several different ways that we store our dinghy around the outboard without the outboard dinghy lift, and none of them are fantastic. They're functional, right, but not fantastic. If I had an inboard with the dinghy on the transom, that would be super convenient. Steering control and docking, inboard versus outboard. So on the outboard, obviously you have directional control of the back end of the boat, which is really nice, and you have a bow thruster, so those two together make docking relatively easy. On the inboard, you have a prop and a rudder, so if you're going in reverse, then the water's not going across the rudder, you lose quite a bit of steering, but there's a stern thruster in addition to the bow thruster on an inboard. So not nearly as much control at slow speeds on an inboard versus an outboard, but here and again, both of them are manageable. You just have to be driven differently when you're docking. And then last thing on my list here was heat. So keep the cabin warm. So on an outboard, there's a Webasto diesel heater with a 5-gallon diesel tank. So yeah, I have a gasoline boat with a 5-gallon diesel tank. The diesel tank's actually on the port side of the boat, and the gas is on the starboard side of the boat. So when we have to go fill that diesel tank up, it's quite comical because we pull up on the starboard side, gas up with 100 and something gallons of gas, then we cast off, turn the boat around, come up on the port side, and then put in $4 worth of diesel. On an inboard, there is no obviously diesel tank. There's a Webasto heater on the Northwest Edition, but the Webasto heater just takes a suction out of the main diesel tank, so there's no second tank to have to manage. But nothing wrong inboard versus outboard. Between the two, it's all personal preference. Just depends on what you like and how you plan to use the boat. Hope you find this video useful, and thanks again for watching.
Again, thanks for watching, and don't forget to like, subscribe to our channel, and hit the bell for notifications so you get notified whenever we post a new video. And if you have any questions, go ahead and put it in the comments section below, and we'll get back to you. And stay tuned for more channel surfing.